Welcome to another episode of Lifting the Lid on Technology, your go-to insights for the latest tech and innovation. I'm Barry White, your host and VCIO at SoftSource FeedBridge. Well, I just want to welcome Leon Davis to the podcast this afternoon. Leon is our technical pre-sale solutions architect. It's quite a mouthful, that, Leon.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. And it is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah. I've asked you along today to really talk about Copilot adoption, and you've had well over 20 years experience now working across a broad range of cloud and infrastructure technologies, but in particular, you had the luxury, if you like, of very early exposure to Copilot when it was first introduced into New Zealand. Prior to general availability, when Microsoft introduced it here to a range of corporate customers, and you were involved in onboarding some of those customers. And so, I was really keen for you to share with us that experience and what you learnt from that.
Yeah, no worries. As you mentioned, I've been lucky enough to be involved in Copilot from the early days. Bit of experience in presenting Microsoft educational workshops and planning and deployment of Copilot for organisations. And I've also been fortunate enough to have delivered Copilot workshops, planning and deployment of one of the main TV networks in New Zealand, which was it was quite a big size organisation, actually one of the larger ones that I've done. So gained quite a bit of experience from that great bunch of people to work with. Yeah.
I mean, for those people listening to this podcast who are perhaps less familiar with the jargon, because there is a lot of jargon around AI, everybody's talking about large language models. And I mean, just for the benefit of us mere mortals, if you like, what would be a good description of what a large language model actually is? Because I think a lot of people are confused by that.
Yeah, so that's right. Large language models, that's a bit of a bingo buzzword in the industry these days, right? There's a bit of confusion out there, maybe lack of understanding sometimes on what they can do. Now, basically, large language models are an input-output system, right? So they're trained on vast amounts of data sets. That's the likes of text from books, websites, articles, more, that sort of thing. And by processing all this information, they kind of learn the patterns and structure of language, similar to us humans use our brains to learn the patterns and structure of language in early days.
So how would you describe generative AI, which, I guess ChatGPT was really the first real exposure that most people had to this new, if you like, strand of AI? Just explain what generative AI actually is and how that relates to these large language models.
Yeah, so there's another component of it, actually, natural language processing, which kind of allows processing similar to like human spoken language, that sort of thing. Its ability of a computer program to basically understand human language in its spoken and written form, that coupled together with large language models is basically some of the inner workings behind the scene when it comes to generative AI. And I think the word generative explains a lot. It's an input request that generates an output, right? Whether that's text, whether that's imagery, whether that's audio. It generates an output on an input request.
Yeah, I think the thing that really fascinates me the most is, when we talk about AI, a lot of people are under the perception that it's all very new, but of course AI has been around a long time now, in fact, many decades, and there've been a number of different strands to AI. For example, we've been working with things like OCR technology and robotic engineering for some years. But of course, this new sort of generative AI technology has really only become possible due to the availability of processor speed, right? And data, of course, just huge amounts of data, which are now possible through the cloud. And I think that's been the big, if you like, turn of the page that we've seen happen. And of course, the last 10 years, we've just seen phenomenal growth, right?
That's right, yeah. So AI is not a new concept. I think an early idea of a computer program running under AI concepts was written down in sort of mid-50s. We come to sort of early 60s. We had machine learning in the early 60s, right? Fast forward to 2017, I think this is where the big breakthrough was in neural networks, right? Now, neural networks is similar to the way that brain patterns happen, right? So that's the ability that's been able to tie all this stuff together. Fast forward to 2021, we have generative AI, thanks to neural networks and tying all that stuff together. So yeah, AI is not a new concept.
The incredible little, I guess, slightly fun fact there, and when you talked about large language models, is because these are effectively usual neural pathways to learn, is that as human beings we're relatively inefficient at transferring information between each other, right? So we do it through, reading or through watching, in this case, listening to a podcast. But our methodology for transferring information is very, very slow. Whereas you talked earlier about these large language models, learning things from huge amounts of data and huge amounts of text. Once a single large language model has, if you like, learned a particular topic or a particular subject, so they can almost, if you like, talk to themselves and transfer that information at just, incredible speeds, which is just not possible with the human brain. So I think it blows my mind, and to a large degree has made this technology what it is today, because, the amount of data that's been absorbed into these things is just incredible.
That's right, yeah.
So Len, if we kind of turn our attention to more around Copilot, in particular, Copilot adoption, what does that process look like? And particularly from that experience that you have had through those early adopter programs, what does that process look like for these organisations?
Yeah, look, it's definitely a journey, right? And I think a lot of people need to understand that it is a journey. It's an organisational journey. Start with identifying stakeholders, right? Identifying use cases inside the business or organisation. This will help you sort of identify why you're deploying Copilot. And give you something tangible to measure for success on the flip side, right? Second thing that's quite important is to get leadership buy-in. That's extremely important. It's an organisational change ahead. It kind of drives it from the top down, so it's very important to get leadership buy-in. Alongside of that, you kind of want to start assessing your organisation earlier on in the piece, right? So there's a couple of different streams under deployment framework for Copilot. We got user enablement and we have the technical readiness streams there. So it's pretty important to get those assessments going in terms of maturity in your organisation as to where you are in those onboarding journeys under user adoption and sort of technical streams there. So you get that going earlier in the piece, and then you want to identify some early adopters and champion users, right? Copilot's a deployment cycle, right? So you start off with a bunch of Copilot pilot users. You deploy Copilot to those. You'll go through a pilot program. You'll gain a lot of invaluable information from that pilot program, which will recycle into your next batch of users. So it's an iterative process, and you keep recycling that process around and improving it each time you deploy Copilot to a bunch of users, right? It gets better and better. By the time you're sort of towards the end of your pilot users, you've got a fair idea of the training content that you need to tweak and deliver for the next cycle round.
You talked there about leadership buy-in. Do you think these SLT groups, do you think their expectation around what this technology actually does is in the right place at the moment? Do you think they have a sufficient understanding of what's possible today, or do you think that's perhaps the marketing's got a little bit ahead of the reality for some of these businesses? In other words, they expect Copilot to do things that out of the box just aren't really possible.
Yeah, look, I think it's a mixed bag out there. I think there is quite a bit of understanding around Copilot and what it can do for some of those people that are a little bit technically minded. The reverse exists on the flip side too, right? There is a lot of marketing stuff around Copilot, what it can do, and it sort of creates a bit of brainstorming in people's minds, and while it kind of can't make your lunch for you, it can do some pretty cool things there, right? So I think there's a bit of setting expectations from an educational perspective on what Copilot can do in this first instance, right? I find educational workshops are a really good way to get into organisations and just set across the board the expectations of what Copilot can do.
Can you give us some examples of where you've sort of come across that firsthand? I mean, what would be? I mean, use the example of it doesn't make the tea, which was a little bit disappointing to hear that for the first time. But all seriousness, I mean, what would be a great example of that expectation perhaps being a little bit misaligned?
Yeah, probably email's a good one, right? So there's a bit of an expectation that we've got a personal assistant that can completely take care of our email. Not quite there yet, although I'm pretty sure it's coming in the future. Just that's a basic example, right? So emails can generate a response for you, right? It's a draft response. You still have that human intervention, right? It's not going to take care of your whole workday for you just yet. But that's just one example of just setting expectations, right, as to where Copilot's at the moment in terms of its capability. Excel's another one. There's some good stuff coming out in Excel. I think it's early days as well within Excel. Ability to create formulas, pivot tables, that sort of thing, graphs. That's great stuff. But as that develops and enhances, it will probably get to a point where it can do end-to-end stuff completely automated, right? There's some great stuff out there, but a lot more to come, I think. And just setting those expectations as to where we are at and that level of technology and what we can get out of it at the moment is a good way to sort of get everyone on the same page in organisation as to what they can expect out of Copilot.
Yeah, the reality is that, that the free or the out-of-the-box version that we've all got access to as part of our Microsoft subscription in itself is an extremely powerful tool, and I think, that as a first step, for a lot of these customers, just getting really conversant and confident with what they can do with that tool is a really good starting point. A great example of that would be, I've personally found myself using Copilot pretty much 70% of the time in preference to a Google search engine because it can get me to the answer I'm looking for faster, right? So I have Copilot on my mobile phone. I have Copilot on my desktop, of course. And if I need to ask a question, previously I would have gone to Google and typed a couple of keywords in. Now I find myself writing a prompt, which might take me a little bit longer, but the outcome is that I get a whole lot of citations and I get to that point really, really quickly, which otherwise could have taken me, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of trawling through websites to finally get the answer I was looking for. And I think that alone is probably, for many organisations, the killer application and the change of the way they work, right?
That's right, yeah. I just want to add there, don't get confused with the couple of Copilot versions for free, right? So there is a bit of a difference with Copilot Free, Copilot Pro. They are designed for individuals, not necessarily organizations. And there is an organization SKU for Copilot, right? Those are the ones that we want our organizations to focus on. They give a bit more stuff in Teams. They give you graph grounding, which gives you that magic stuff that happens inside your organization's 365 tenant. With ingesting data from the likes of OneDrive, SharePoint, graph connectors, that sort of thing. So you get all that with the organizational license. You get your enterprise-grade data protection and the ability to use customization and extend Copilot as well, using the likes of Copilot X Studio and extensions and so forth. So yeah, recommended for organizations that they do look at the organizational SKU for Copilot. But yeah, of course, the free and the Copilot Pro versions are great ways to sort of get familiar with Copilot, do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and bring back relevant results quite quickly.
So you use the term grounding there, and a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with what grounding actually is and what that means. And again, that's probably a good way to distinguish. People often asking me, well, what's the difference between Copilot and ChatGPT? Well, I think in the context of what you're talking about with the paid version or the enterprise version of Copilot, it's able to ground that data against your internal data as well as the web data, right? Do you want to explain that a little bit more? Because I think that's probably, as you say, an area that's misunderstood by a lot of people.
So yeah, there is two versions of grounding. One is the web grounding. That actually comes with the free Copilot, the Copilot Pro. That'll go out and ground your information or your request through Copilot out to the web. It'll bring back relevant information around that request, right? And try and ground the results a bit more to what you're looking for. The important one for organizations is Microsoft Graph Grounding, right? This is where the magic happens inside your Office 365 tenant. It has a lot of context about interactions with documents, data, user behavioral type things, and it makes the Copilot response more relevant to your data, your tenant, your organization, right? So you only get that with the organization paid SKU license there. And that's kind of where the magic that has been showcased around Copilot productivity versions is, right? So yeah, important to just recognize the difference. So you get the web grounding and the Copilot free and pro versions. They are really designed for individuals.
What would be a great example of that, Leon? You talked a little bit earlier about summarizing emails, but what would be a good scenario with email? I don't know, maybe around meetings would be a great example of how that grounding would work if, for example, somebody emailed you and you wanted to schedule a meeting with them.
Yeah. So, in terms of grounding, we're looking at, features like the auto schedule for meetings, that sort of thing, draft responses for emails relevant in your data, that sort of thing, bringing forward documents that might be relevant to a certain meeting coming up in Teams, that sort of thing. So, yeah, that grounding really makes it unique to your environment, your usage, behavioral patterns, and your data.
What are some of the things that organizations, or challenges, if you like, that organizations need to be thinking about when it comes to data? Because, again, my observations, and this predates AI or Copilot conversations with clients, is that clients have got a lot of data in their tenancy. And in many cases, they don't even know what they've got and they don't know who can get at it, right? What are some of the things that organizations need to be thinking about if they're onboarding Copilot? I guess that sort of comes into some of that planning and that assessment that you talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, that's right. I have a saying that Copilot is only as good as your current data management and security posture, right? So that means if you have a poor data management practice and security practices over the years, Copilot experience is likely to be pretty poor, probably surface some stuff that you don't really want people to see. The reverse exists also, right? So if you've got good data hygiene and security and governance practices in your organization, you should be in a reasonably good state. Doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't go and revisit that. And in fact, that should be revisited on a regular basis. So it is only as good as your current data security and governance posture, right? So that's a pretty important piece in Copilot. And quite often, although we mention two tracks, there's a user enablement track and a technical readiness track, there can quite often be a third track derived out of the technical readiness track, depending on the current posture of the organization, right? Depending on how much effort and remediation needs to be done around data governance and security, that sort of thing.
What would be a common scenario that you've come across? I know when I talk to clients or I see people turning on Copilot for the first time, the first thing they do is start typing in payroll and salary and words like that into it, trying to find out what they can find out. But putting aside that very obvious example, I mean, what would be another example of types of things you're seeing that people have turned up when they've been using Copilot?
Yeah, we've all heard the payroll stories, haven't we? So that is quite a common one that we hear in the industry. A couple of companies that I've worked with, quite often the users are starting to find contractual stuff, remuneration reviews, that sort of thing, if they're not locked up under strict access lists. And again, that comes down to regularly reviewing things like access lists into data repositories, that sort of thing as well. If you've got good hygiene practices and you're regularly reviewing that stuff, then it shouldn't be a problem for you. But if you haven't got good practices, then that piece might be quite big just to lock down that data access and so forth.
Yeah, I think, it's been a few years now since New Zealand introduced its new privacy legislation, or should I say updated its privacy legislation. But, I think more than ever now, organisations need to be, if they're not already familiar with the nuances of that particular piece of regulatory compliance, that they upskill on it, because, as you say, from a privacy point of view, businesses and particularly directors are liable for that data. And so whilst AI opens up a door for some fantastic opportunities, let's be honest, it also opens the door for bad actors to perhaps do things that you don't want them to do as well, purely because it's easier for them, right? They can use the Copilot to do the looking, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, look, it is true. However, what I'm finding is that Copilot's actually been a bit of a caveat for people to go in and actually check this stuff. So it's actually forcing the hand in most organisations to do something that they've been meaning to do for some years now. So the driver to deploy Copilot, and if you look at the framework and what's involved in deploying it successfully, right, and that's pushing people or guiding people into that data security and governance piece that they've been putting off for some years, right? So it is a good thing. There's some scary things under the hood in some of the organisations that I've been through, but it's nothing that you can't fix and get right and lay the foundational framework to deploy Copilot on, and then you're sort of introducing good practices into the organisation too. So it's actually pushing people to tighten up the security belts in their organisations, which is a great thing.
Yeah. No, it's going to be, as I say, it's going to be the one of the spaces to watch. Hey, Leon, I'm conscious of the time. Look, we could talk for hours on this topic, but we'll leave it there. It's probably a good place to stop. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to do this again. And just final thank you for coming on today, and I really appreciate your time.
No problem. Thanks for having me, and hopefully this has been informative for everyone.
I'm Barry White, signing off. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep lifting that lid.